This is really a talk about mechanisms of purpose. And the bottom line is that there's multiple purpose mechanisms within us. In a sense, we all contain multiple purposes. And sometimes they all swim in the same direction, cognitive goals and motivational desires. And that gives oomph to the goals, and that's great. But sometimes they swim in different directions, these different purposes. And that's what I'd like to kind of focus on today, because we can see the identity of some of the less intuitive mechanisms that are still very powerful. So desires, motivational desires, mesolimbic desires that can give oomph to cognitive goals, they often go together, and they evolve to go together. In our life, they often do, so that's a good thing, but sometimes they come apart. And I'm using prediction here to kind of stand in for cognitive desires based on what you know. In the morning, Mariska stood here with a comment on the first talk and said, you can imagine going in and getting berries and yogurt. If you know there's berries and yogurt and you're hungry in the morning, that can pull you in, that can attract you. You have memories of berries and yogurt in the past and you can expect them in the future, so that pulls you in. That's a prediction. And sometimes it's a total prediction. And as an example, I'll give you a couple of concrete examples of mechanisms playing a part. One would be wanting what you know is going to be bad, either because you know it's going to be disgusting, it's always been disgusting. It's always been disgusting in the past. Is it possible to wake up and suddenly want to? Or something that you know is going to hurt you because it's hurt you in the past, you predict it will hurt you, it will hurt you, and yet you want it. There's no pleasure to be had, there's no value. That sort of thing doesn't fit our usual way of looking at desires, either cognitively or in psychology, behavioral learning theory, or usually past outcomes, value of past outcomes determines our predictions of future values of the same. And desire is almost synonymous with our prediction of outcomes gained. Back to predictive processing, there are some philosophers who will write, like Andy Clark, that predictive processing always replaces desire with prediction. So it's to say you don't really need extra prediction, but they exist, and sometimes they detach. So we'll look at two examples of wanting what you know is disgusting and wanting what you know hurts. And maybe to give us just a concrete example of it, let's see, wanting what you know hurts. This is a situation from an affective neuroscience lab. We're working mostly with animals, but there's going to be implications. This is a situation where a rat is in a box and there's a little electrified shock rod, and the rat never has to touch it. Nobody's going to ever make the rat touch this rod, but they'll voluntarily explore and they'll touch it once, maybe twice, and then stay far away from it. They'll show usually anti-predator reactions like this mother ground squirrel is showing to the rattlesnake approaching her burrow in the spring. Rattlesnakes can't eat the mother, they can't swallow them, but they can eat pups in the burrow that are in the burrow in the spring. Rattlesnakes do that, and the ground squirrel is sort of picking sand at the rattlesnake. These rats who have been in the shock rod chamber, they bury the shock rod at the same defense. Let's see, normal rat, and let's also see a rat who's going to have a little brain activation. Mesolimbic system, we'll come back to the mechanisms of that later, but let's just see the example. So this is a normal rat, and here's the shock rod. And you got once she got a shock, she got two shocks, she'll never touch it again, and she's starting to show a little bit of that activation. Here's a rat who has activation of its amygdala whenever it gets within a centimeter of the shock rod, and got shocked, she's got a shock, she's come back, she's sort of really fascinated with this rod that just shocked her, hovering over it, looking at it, looking at it, looking at it. She gets another shock, and she gets another. So we compare the normal rat. This is a maladaptive desire. It's irrational. There's nothing to be gained by touching this rod except a shock, which hurts. Want to do. So how can that be? We didn't start with shock rods and these maladaptive irrational desires. We sort of stumbled into it over the years, over decades, really. And it all started for me with sort of a search decades ago for brain mechanisms of pleasure, which we thought we had decades ago. The dopamine neurotransmitter is still synonymous with pleasure in a lot of uses. That time, most neuroscientists of reward thought it was. People like Will Wise was a special champion of that. Roy had quotes like this: "Dopamine junctions are a synaptic way station where synaptic inputs are transmitted messages we experience as yumminess." And he came to that conclusion from experiments where he would suppress dopamine systems in rats, dopamine blocking drug. They gradually abandoned rewards of all kinds. Food rewards, they nibble a bit and then they leave them alone. Sex rewards, drug rewards, brain stimulation, electrode rewards, they all fell away. And the notion was they didn't seem to want them anymore. It was as though they didn't like them anymore. So the pleasure had drained out, so trying it. Our first experiment was a collaboration with Worldwise, and we thought we would add a little bit of evidence on top of this enormous pyramid of evidence for dopamine pleasure. It just turned out to be disappointing. We were looking at it, pleasure in a different way, not just seeking and consuming, choosing, working, looking at sort of the reaction to rewards, the affective reaction we actually got it. Kind of like human parents ask their newborn babies, do you like the taste? So here's a newborn baby that just got sugar water on its tongue and goes very fast. Let's see it again. This is Jacob Steiner in Israel. First day of life, sugar water, relaxed tongue protrusions, relaxed face. Here's a rat who's getting sugar water infused into its mouth painlessly through oral cannula. You see it from underneath and we slow it down so you can see the reactions. Tongue protrusions flicking out the lips. Sweetness. Bitterness is very different. Bitterness, baby squinches its eyes, nose gapes, sort of triangular openings of the mouth. Rats can't scrunch their nose and eyes. They don't have musculature, but they can gape. They can shake their head. They can play versus disgust to these different tastes. We thought if we suppressed dopamine, those liking reactions would go down. We were disappointed they didn't. So we tried something a little bit more severe than the dopamine drugs, which is to eliminate dopamine in the brain. It's possible to do it through a little microinjection of a neurotoxin, 6-hydroxydopamine, into the dopamine bundle. It only kills neurons that have dopamine. Other neurons are okay. And it kills all the neurons with dopamine. So the rats are like very severe Parkinson's patients. The next day, they don't eat voluntarily. They don't drink voluntarily. Treat them as though we're in the hospital and feed them and integrate them. And they can stay in good health. Question is now, surely they wouldn't like anything yet. If you give them sweet tastes, they do. These are, the black dot is a normal rat. Normal rats, the white dot are rats who have lost 98% or more of their dopamine, so they have only less than 2% of their dopamine. Normal liking reactions to sweetness, no aversive reactions. They can learn new likes and dislikes. So for example, we take the sweet taste, it's a new sweet taste, pair it with nausea a couple times to create a learned taste aversion. Do they still learn things about taste? And the answer is yes, everybody does. They now it's disgusting to everybody. So dopamine, without dopamine, you can learn new likes and dislikes. You have normal liking, but they didn't seem to want it. If we turned on the dopamine system, we would produce, conversely, sort of seeking and wanting, consuming, but the liking reactions never went up. It's fair to say, though, in the first 10 years of this hypothesis, it started in the 90s, probably nobody in the field believed us because dopamine pleasure meme was so strong. Until finally people started in the 2000s to do human experiments that were somewhat similar, and they got similar results. So just as one example, this is people given cocaine. This is Marco Layton at Yale University. He's giving people cocaine. Come in, have some cocaine in various doses. Let's just look at the black lines here on the right side of the graph. These are increasing doses of cocaine. And the higher the dose, the more you like the cocaine, the higher the euphoria of the cocaine. Also, look at the black line here. The higher the dose of cocaine, the more you want to take even more cocaine. It's the nature of cocaine, if you want to consume more. Then the question is, what happens if you take cocaine, but you're dopamine suppressed? So he either gives dopamine blocking drugs or a amino acid cocktail that stops the synthesis of dopamine for a few hours. And will liking ratings go down? You see the red line is this. The red line is not really going down. They still like the cocaine just as much. It's just as euphoric. But they're wanting to take more cocaine, especially at the higher doses. That's suppressed. So in humans like rats, dopamine seems more about wanting things than it's this mesolimbic kind of like wanting. That's very interesting. There's an application of this. My colleague at Michigan, Terry Robinson, in the 90s had been doing experiments giving drugs of abuse, cocaine or amphetamine or morphine or heroin, to rats, and finding that dopamine systems in everybody shows tolerance if you keep taking the drugs. But some individuals also show an opposite effect, which is sensitization of their dopamine systems, which means that their systems, if you take the same dose of drug, they actually release more dopamine the 10th time than they did the first time for that same dose. And once this is induced in a vulnerable individual, it lasts even if you stop taking the drugs for months or a year. So dopamine was pleasure liking. It wouldn't really make sense for addiction because you get more pleasure. But if dopamine is wanting, then a sensitized individual can come to want the drug more and more over time, even if they had less and less pleasure. So it's this sort of wanting versus distinction. But let's go back to this mesolimbic wanting versus rational cognitive desires that are based upon past affective experiences. As we said, for most cases when we think of rational desires, we expect to desire them to the degree that we predict them to be good in some sense for us, and that's often based upon past experiences. In addiction neuroscience field, one way of dealing with this sort of rational kind of approach has been through Tony Dickinson's work. He's a Cambridge, England animal learning theorist who's done a lot on habit versus goal-directed animals' behaviors. And it really stems from an experience in his own life. He was a student. In the 1960s, he went down to Sicily for a summer vacation and enjoyed the beaches there. And for the first time in his life, he tasted watermelon. England in the 1950s and 60s wasn't conducive to watermelon. Down in Sicily, he tastes watermelon after a hot day on the beach, and it's cold and it's delicious and it's sweet and it's thirst quenching too. And it was wonderful. It was a revelation. He just loved this watermelon for the first time in his life tasted. That night, he went out to a local tavern and he got very, very, very drunk, which had happened many times in his life before. He became ill. He became nauseous. The next day, he was on the beach again, hungover, hot, feeling thirsty, and he thought, what would make him feel a little better? And he thought, watermelon, make him feel a little better. It was delicious yesterday. So he went into the town square and he bought a slab of watermelon, and he felt a little queasy as he looked at it, but then he tasted it, and it was disgusting. Disgusting. He had developed a learned taste aversion based on the nausea of the alcohol the night before. He had often drunk red wine before. He didn't form an aversion to wine, but the watermelon was new. That coupled with the nausea created an aversion. He's never had watermelon since, he says. That was 50 years ago. So that was a learned discovery. Tony, the question is, what was in his mind when he got up off the beach blanket on the second day? He already had an aversion for watermelon, but he didn't know that he had an aversion. He didn't know it until he retasted the watermelon. And for Tony Dickinson, this is why conscious pleasure exists. To give you the experience of watermelon the first day, so your entire cognitive apparatus can then in the future be determined to get you watermelon. But now, one retasting as discussed, and never ever in his life again has he pursued watermelon. He thinks this is basically conscious pleasure and conscious displeasures exist so that they can recruit all of your cognitive apparatus in one go, as opposed to incremental learning of the sort that. But he went back to the lab and he thought, could he create this in animals? Because he's interested in this rational kind of desire based upon past experience. And if you remember the first bunny this morning, who had a thought of a carrot, Tony Dickinson believes that bunny exists, can have a thought for a carrot, and it can be evaluated. And so he went back to the lab, he did this. He let the rats learn to press for sugar water, and they liked it, and they worked to do that. Then separately, at home, in their home cage, he gave them sugar water followed by nausea, lithium chloride injection that creates nausea, would create a learned aversion. So it's like Tony going out and getting very, very drunk. Then he brings them back to the chamber where they can press a lever for the sugar water, but he turns off the sugar water. So it's a little bit like Tony Dickinson on the second day getting up off the beach blanket looking for what is to be found. And the question is, what will they do? And the answer is, they still press. They press. They have an aversion, but they're like Tony Dickinson. They're going to buy the watermelon. They're pressing for the sugar water. It's in extinction, so they're not actually getting sugar. They're pressing. How to make them not press? Well, you could turn on the sugar water here. They'd get it and they'd stop. But there's another way to make them not press. And that is any place, at home or in a different room, give them a free taste of sugar water. Just like Tony Dickinson getting the watermelon on that second day. One retasting should revalue if they're cognitive like Tony. And they did. So free taste of sugar at home, prevented them from pressing ever again in the future. To kind of give this logic, just to kind of show it again, because it's going to be. So normally it has a positive value, something has a positive value, but for creating a learned aversion that you get after your last experience with a positive value. Probably in the extinction. If you hadn't had the aversion, if you're a rat, you start pressing and then you go gradually down to extinction because there's no sugar level. If you had got the part nausea, so you should have taste it, do the same thing. You're identical. You can't tell the difference. You have one retasting in the new value, which is now very low. It's disgusting. Now go back to the chamber and no work at all. So they're very much like Tony Dickinson in this way. His whole point is that rats are capable of revaluing the goal based upon these retasting, but retasting is essential. You have to experience the affective outcome in order to modify rational desire. So that makes sense how it feels. Likewise, if we increase the value of things, it works the same way. So a hunger, well, you've been hungry before, and so have rats. But how about a new hunger you haven't had, like salt hunger, sodium deficient state? That, if it goes up, created overnight by giving hormones. Now, if we put you in an extinction, if you're a rat, you look again identical, you just work through the same behavior. If you were to taste salt, it would be now very, very tasty in your sodium deficient state. Give one free taste of it, and now we put them back, and they work very, very hard. This is exactly the result Tony Dickinson gets. Appetites like salt. It's rational. Makes sense. Rats are behaving as we might expect ourselves to behave. But mesolimbic wanting, dopamine kind of wanting, actually doesn't work that way. The abstract rules it follows were originally described by Dalbert Bindra, a Canadian psychologist, and elaborated by Fred Tokes, a British psychologist. Abstractly, these are the rules it follows. It transforms the perception of cues, thoughts of berries and yogurt, images of it, and gives them attention-grabbing motivational quality. It gives them approach-eliciting motivation. If they're not there, if they're there, they become motivational magnets. They may be consumed and nibbled by rats. If they're not there, they may be sought out. Seek these cues. They're attracted. Want these cues. And they can trigger surges of desire. Cue can trigger surges of desire to consume the reward itself. So the smell of food makes you suddenly hungry. Walking down the street. Sort of thing. But not always. The cue power, motivational power, is gated by physiological state. As rules, these sound abstract and maybe boring, but let's show how they work. This is a diagram from Fred Tokes to show how bodily signals are going to modify. But let's actually see this example. This is wanting what you know is disgusting. Think of salt and salt appetite. A little bit of salt is nice, but if you're at the beach and you swallow ocean water, it may be nasty. Imagine you're in the Dead Sea, the Middle East, which is 3 times saltier than ocean water. That's very, very nasty. Rats don't like it. We don't like it. Squirt it into their mouths, they'll gain Dead Sea saltiness, about 10% sodium chloride. Suppose a rat gets a squirt of Dead Sea saltiness, so it's really learning that this is disgusting. Then it suddenly wakes up in a state of sodium deficiency. We know what it should do in Tony Dickinson's kind of framework. It should have to retaste the salt to get the value, because now it's nice if you did retaste it. But what if you haven't retasted it yet? Let's see an actual example. This is going to be a cue-guided experiment. We're going to see a rat, and there's going to be 2 cues. They're both levers that can pop out of a wall. One lever pops out of the wall on the right side lever, and it predicts that the rat's going to get a squirt of sugar water into its mouth. Now, the rat doesn't have to do anything to the lever, but you're going to see the rats do jump on the lever and nibble it. The lever is just a Pavlovian cue predicts. They're going to nibble it, so they're attracted. That's instead of saying cue attraction. Another lever pops out of the wall, and it predicts Dead Sea saltiness. And the rat's going to stay away from it. It learns this cue, to stay away from it and avoid it. And one day it wakes up in a new state of sodium deficiency and salt appetite, because we gave it hormones overnight. If it tasted salt now, it would love it, even Dead Sea saltiness, sugar-like. But the question is, what will it do to the cues before it has encountered actually taste it? How will it respond? Will it still avoid it? I'll have to relearn to see. we'll see the training data for the normal state. This is the normal state. So this is going to be the sugar lever. It pops out, and the rat you can see is on it. The sugar infusion hasn't started yet. Lever's out, and the rat's really nibbling. Now the sugar infusion comes down. It says you see sugar water's coming down. It's showing the light variations. This lever will be the salt lever. This is a normal day, a training day, and the rat knows what it means. It sees it, and it stays away at the far side, tries to get out. Now it's going to see something. But now it wakes up in the new state, and we've turned off the water, the sugar, water, and salt. This is the salt lever. On the first time it comes out in the new state, you see the rats on it. Attracted to this cue for saltiness, which has always been discussed. Prescient desire. It's never retasted yet. How does it have this desire? It's never grounded in affective experience. It has no memory of that's positive. It has only memories of disgust. So what's powering the desire? We can get a little psychological explanation. A hint comes from an old Polish psychologist when Poland was still behind the Iron Curtain, who had suggested always that Pavlovian cues, they trigger two separate kinds of associations. One is an affective association, in this case disgust. Cue predicts disgust. But the other is a sensory association. The cue predicts saltiness. If saltiness on this new day were tasted, it would be liked. It's not been tasted yet, but the cue association for saltiness allows the incentive salience, this mesolimbic dopamine-dependent desire, to be sort of generated anew. The physiological states modulating the cues. This is for the first time in its life, and then giving this value. So it's creating incentive alliesthesia to want what's never been liked in the past, and so it's been discussed. That still might kind of have a slight prediction-related interpretation. If you're a prediction theorist, you might say, well, the rat has this saltiness representation, and maybe based upon this salty memory in this new state, it can use that to generate an implicit prediction of value in the future. Even though it's never experienced in the past, it's generating a prediction on the fly, not just a desire. Fair enough. The second example of wanting what hurts, I think, closes that escape route. Here, there's no prediction that helps the desire. In fact, the prediction that this nasty shock is a shock is actually going to be part of the desire. Not going to be these things. So to kind of give you a little better sense of what this manipulation is, we're doing it through the amygdala, but we're really recruiting this mesolimbic dopamine system to create desire. Why are we doing the amygdala? Because the amygdala is sort of a perceptual, motivational learning interface. It kind of recognizes the motivational significance of percepts. So it's famous for learned fear, for recognizing threats, but it's also involved in learning rewards and cues and attractions for rewards. We want to assign motivational value to what we want to assign, in this case, the chakra. That's why we're using the amygdala to do it. Learning. What's going to stimulate it is optogenetic stimulation. Be familiar with it, but if you're not, basically a little micro injection was done in the amygdala, put in a virus containing a gene for a photoreceptor, like photoreceptors in the eyes. It'll be simpler. And the gene makes these neurons sprout the photoreceptors in the amygdala. The gene can't spread. The virus is not infected, can't spread. The right where it's placed, it can make the neurons sprout photoreceptors. If blue light is shown on the photoreceptors change shape and it opens up ion gates that excite the neurons, so the neurons start making the and it's going to be turned on whenever the rat gets within a centimeter. So let's see it again. There's more cases. First, we'll see a normal rat, and it'll have a laser, but it doesn't have photoreceptors in the virus, so it's getting everything except the photoreceptors. Then we'll see some real. Oops. Oh, here we go. So this is a normal rat. It's got a virus, but not a photoreceptor. So you can see it's afraid and it's doing the defensive barrier to the whole thing. So that's a normal defensive fearful reaction. Here's a photoreceptor rat, a Kennerodopsin rat, and you can see she's come back. She's very, very interested. So she's getting shocks again. Here's a different rat. So attracted, that's nibbling and getting shocks on its mouth. Here's a third rat. Here's a fourth rat, different sexes, both sexes, different strains of rats, all rats do it. 10 rats, 9 of them will show this. It's a very robust phenomenon. It's making them want this shock rod. Now, I think they want the shock rod, they want the rod that has hurt them. They don't want to be hurt necessarily. They're not throwing themselves on their rod to get the shock. They just can't resist the rod. They can't resist it to the point that they might have to nibble on it. But it's a competitive, it's incentive, it's a reward motivation. It's not a defensive motivation. We can show it in a couple of ways. So for example, if you thought they were responding defensively to this rod that shocked it, and so they're attacking it, no, we'll say, we'll protect you. Put you on a safety side of this barrier. The rod can't get you, just stay where you are, you're safe. What does the rat do? These rats, they climb over the barrier. And if they do climb over and get another shock, we gently pull them back and put them on the safe side again. They climb over a second time if they wish. And so in a 20-minute session, these rats are climbing on average 5 times over the barrier to get to it. They're touching the rod each time. Some of them are touching multiple times and getting 15 shocks per time. They're seeking it out in spite of the safety thing they are seeking. Yet, the shock is actually part of their attraction. It's not just that they're going for the laser. That's associated. We can use a dummy rod that's identical, but it doesn't give shocks. And it'll be paired with laser. So they can get the laser by touching this dummy rod. And they don't. The dummy rod is not nearly attractive as the shock rod. That is shock. There's a reason that it's Is it they want laser? No, they weren't attracted to the dummy rod, and we can take them in other situations where all you have to do is touch this. Laser, no shocks, no worries. Just get the laser if that's what you want. And they will work a little. Some will work substantially for it. Others work just a little bit, and many of them don't work at all for this, even though they were attracted to the shock. Laser is a moderate incentive, not at all incentive for some, but put the laser on the shock rod, and the shock rod is a powerful incentive, irresistible shots. Why are they attracted neurally and psychologically? Well, neurally they're attracted. The neural reason is because their whole mesolimbic system lights up, just the way it would light up to sugar cues or to the salty cue on the special sodium deficiency. We look at the brains afterwards, we see activation in the dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra and ventral tegmentum, activation in the nucleus accumbens, activation in the cortex. This is the same thing that lights up to reward cues. It's a reward cue lighting up, even though it's a shock rod. That's major. The last thing related to this is the reason I think they want the rod, not the shock. But the rod is a cue for the shock. The reason I think that is because they want other cues that are associated with the shock too. So every time they touched the shock rod and got the shock, they also heard a special sound, beep, whenever they done it, beep. It's a shock associated with the sound, beep, means shock. You can ask the rats, do you want to hear this sound? Take them out of the shock rod situation. Put them in a place where they can poke in this hole and they'll hear that sound, beep. Poke in this hole, they'll hear nothing. So do they want to hear the shock rod sound? We can ask normal rats that. In this situation. So they poke here, one day they hear the shock rod sound and they hear that sound. Or on a different day, they poke and they hear a sound they've heard at home. It's a safe sound. They've heard it at home the equal number of times. It's a familiar sound. Do the rats want to hear it? These are the results. Let's look at the gray bars first, not the blue bars. The gray bars are normal rats. They will poke a little bit for the safe sound. Gray bar for the CS minus, that's the safe sound. But they do not, normal rats do not want to hear the shock sound. Why would you? The shock sound. It's a frightening sound. But the rats that were attracted to the shock rod, you can see they also want to hear the safe sound a little bit. But they really, really, really want to hear that shock sound. Give me the shock sound again. Give me it again. Give me it again. They're the only rats in the history of the evolution of rats that have wanted to hear a shock-associated sound. It's become an attractive incentive. This mesolimbic activation, in a sense, we think of it as kind of a prototype of addictive motivation as incentive sensitization views addiction. You know, we want independently of liking. This is completely independently. But of course, in most normal addictions in humans and in other animals, the thing that's addictive starts out as light, then might become excessively wanted. It starts out as light. What happens if you do these kinds of brain manipulations on nice things, like putting the laser on sugar or putting the laser on cocaine? That's what we do here. This is a rat. I have one group of rats who they are choosing between cocaine or sugar. They go here, they can get a sugar pellet. Go here, they can get an intravenous painless cocaine infusion. Painless because you can see this little thing on the back of the rat is an intravenous cannula. It doesn't even know it's there, but when it gets connected up, it gets cocaine. If it can't get cocaine, then it has the laser and also oral cannula to give it sugar pellets. This group of rats, if it works for cocaine, it gets cocaine alone. If they choose sugar, they get sugar with the laser. A separate group of rats has the same choice, but they get laser with cocaine, whereas if they choose sugar, they get sugar alone. If you want to know what the situation is like this, nose port comes out and the pokes have got sugar, it shows sugar. Nose portals come out again and can choose and get cocaine. This is the cocaine and this is the laser. But if you want to see the results, this is the results. The group that has the laser on sugar, but gets cocaine by itself, becomes a group of sugar addicts. They only go for sugar. They ignore cocaine. There's nothing magic about intravenous cocaine. It's pitted against sugar with laser. The group that had the laser on the cocaine, they become cocaine addicts, as you might expect, and they ignore sugar. Groups, normal rats that don't have a laser at all, they choose some sugar, they choose some cocaine. Individual rats might have a preference for this, that, but as a group, they're equal. Why not? You can have both. Why not? Unless you have an obsessive addictive desire for just one or the other, created by this brain limbic activation, recruiting the mesolimbic system specifically and more intensely than usual for this one particular directed target. This is irrational kinds of wants, or at least wants that are irrationally intense compared to the. All of this is pure wanting. Even for the sugar, where we can measure sugar liking, it's not enhancing the liking of the sugar. It's only enhancing the wanting. So these are measurable. There's a number of human clinical applications for this kind of dissociation, where wanting comes apart from liking, but also wanting comes apart from the predicted value, the expected value of the reward. As I told Dan in a conversation the other night, when we first had the addiction hypothesis, most of the neuroscience community was not really receptive because they thought, well, dopamine is pleasure. But the one group that was receptive were psychiatrists who were dealing with addicted people. Some of their patients who they would write to us, some of our patients are saying, gee, I don't really like my drug much anymore. I know it'll ruin my life if I relapse and take it again, and I really do not. And yet, at moments, I do relapse and take it again, and I don't understand why I do that. I don't understand myself why I do that. There isn't a reason. There isn't a justification in any outcome. But this mesolimbic kind of want can create it. And over the years, this kind of hypothesis has sort of grown in plausibility. This is citations of that addiction theory, and it really wasn't cited much in its first 20 years, but then started to grow, partly because of the cocaine evidence that I showed you with Marco Layton, from some other. These are from Anna Rose Childress, where she's showing cocaine addicts either cocaine videos or very pleasant nature videos. And what she's showing here is super lighting up of the limbic system to this is a signature of this sensitized mesolimbic wanting, lighting up intensely to the addictive target, to this especially addictive target. It's not an accident that the amygdala is especially lighting up here, though other parts too. Up until about 10 years ago, I thought this applied to drug addiction, but not probably to behavioral addictions. The reason was because we knew a little bit how drugs could sensitize dopamine neurons. A little bit of the cellular and molecular machinery is understood for how drugs can do that. Make the dopamine neurons express more AMPA receptors, so glutamate excites them more, and then they get dopamine release. That made sense. How to do that without drugs? How would you do that? But I should have remembered, actually, that Terry Robinson in the 90s with rats had shown you could sensitize their systems without drugs by stressful emotional experiences. And there's a couple other intense, appetitive, motivational experiences that can create mesolimbic sensitization of the dopamine system that can cross-sensitize us to drugs. In the last 10 years, neuroimaging evidence from some of the behavioral addictions has made me think that, gee, I was wrong, and actually incentive sensitization is happening for some of these behavioral addictions. They're showing this hyperlimbic reactivity to the addictive cues for things like food addiction, hyperlimbic reactivity to food cues, but not other cues. Sex addiction, these are coming from studies mostly with young men who are pursuing sex and pornography so often during the day that it's disturbing even them, and they're coming to a psychiatrist saying, I want to stop, help me, why am I doing this? And they get popped into an fMRI scanner, and they get hyperlimbic activation to sex cues, but not to money cues or food cues. Same sort of thing. Others who are compulsive gamblers reported to have hyperlimbic reactivity to gambling, money cues, but not to sex. So it may be happening. Another clinical phenomenon that's kind of relevant or explainable, understandable by this sort of logic is the diabolical medical experiment that was inadvertently is still going on, being performed for the last 20 years on Parkinson's patients, the inventions of new medications for Parkinson's. The old medication was L-Dopa, which is a precursor for dopamine. So if we take a L-Dopa pill, neurons start making dopamine. Even neurons that are now not making any dopamine will start making dopamine and releasing dopamine. So it's natural dopamine that gets released. But if you take L-Dopa for years and years, there are side effects and consequences. So the new medications to avoid that are called direct agonists. They're not precursors. They're sort of they're artificial dopamine. They directly activate dopamine receptors themselves. So they're like skeleton keys that can go into the lock and turn it on. Some dopamine receptors do activity. There's no natural dopamine being produced. These are great medications and they help the patients. But in a certain percentage of patients, they start to develop behavioral compulsions, addictions. And these are people who were the least likely to have addiction-like things before. Some of them, how many people? Well, 10 years ago, the numbers were, say, 15%, under 20%, popping up in the neurologist's files because they complained or their spouses complained that they were gambling. More recently, the studies are saying nearly half, 45% of patients who get these drugs are showing some of these compulsions. If you show one, there are things like compulsive gambling, compulsive sex, shopping, compulsive binge eating, or compulsive punting, which is like sorting buttons in the drawer at 3 a.m. You can't stop sorting those buttons. If you show one of these things, you might show more. They're not especially pleasant, the drugs, and these activities aren't especially pleasant. But they're compulsive. And if you take two patients, one of whom has the compulsions and the other who's taking the same drugs but doesn't have compulsions, what's different about them? If you give them each a little dose of L-Dopa, pop them into this PET scanner, what we're seeing here is dopamine release in brain structures, the neostriatum caudate putamen and the nucleus accumbens ventral striatum. And everybody's showing dopamine release. Everybody's a Parkinson's patient, and everybody has just taken a dose of the same L-Dopa. The red bars are patients who do not have the compulsions. The blue bars are patients who have some of these compulsions. And you can see that they are showing more dopamine release to the same dose. They are sensitized, basically. They're just like Terry Robinson's rats back in the 90s who showed more dopamine release after they were sensitized. It's the sensitization of the dopamine system that's also their vulnerability to the induction of sensitization that makes them particularly. The last kind of clinical thing I'll mention is sort of the opposite thing. What happens if you pull away dopamine wanting, suppress it? It's a little bit like how we started, by suppressing dopamine and seeing that liking didn't go away, but wanting did. For a number of conditions like depression, schizophrenia, Parkinson's disease, when they're not on medication, psychiatry textbooks and neurology textbooks have said anhedonia are a symptom of all of these conditions. Anhedonia, meaning a loss of pleasure, basically the original dopamine suppression hypothesis. But in the last 10 years or so, people who have investigated that by many of these patients, if you actually give them pleasant things and ask them to rate the pleasure of them, they give normal ratings. They have pleasure capacity. Yet those pleasures don't have value in life. Social family pleasures, career pleasures don't have value. So different terms are being coined for this kind of a thing where it's a selective loss of motivation and value, even though pleasure might be left. Rather than anhedonia, terms like avolition, the loss of volition, of motivation. Think terms like motivational anhedonia or anticipatory anhedonia as opposed to consumatory anhedonia, true anhedonia. And a number of papers reporting these kinds of things for all three of those conditions. So the basic notion is wanting comes away from liking, yes, but wanting sometimes also comes away from predictions of future liking, of future value in ways that are interesting and sometimes powerful. So that's different kinds of goal directives. The conclusions were compared to things attachment.
Well, so, I mean, you know, I love your work and this is great. I read the new paper that you gave me and it's wonderful work. I want to ask a really selfish question, which is how it applies to one of my favorites. A case where you want something that doesn't produce any liking in you, and that's moral behavior. There's some people who like keep a promise, and it's not like they're going to get pleasure from keeping the promise, but they want to, they feel the desire to. Do you think this model might apply to that phenomenon as well?
Well, I think that phenomenon, escapes hedonic explanations, right? So it's the sort of eudaimonic explanation of pursuing values in life that are not necessarily pleasurable.
It might have been pleasurable earlier on, but now.
That's fair enough. But it's still a kind of value of its own kind, right?
Yeah.
And often those kinds of value have motivational oomph too. They might recruit this sort of thing. But what if you had those values with no motivational oomph at all? Sometimes we probably do, where we know what the right thing to do is, and we wish that we would do that thing. We want to kind of do that thing, but we don't really want to, and we don't do that thing. So I think they can come apart that way too. But I wouldn't say that this neurological explanation is key to it. There's multiple ways that can.
I had a hand, but I don't know if I was. Oh, thank you. A couple of questions. It's mostly clarification. So in the case of the amygdala intervention, I just got. I know you said this, but I didn't understand why the dummy rod was without the shock was less attractive to the rats than the one with the shock. I know you said that, but I didn't follow.
I think it's because the amygdala activation by the laser, it's, for some rats it has a little bit of incentive value, right? But not for all. But you paste it on, let's start with sugar or cocaine first and then shock rod first. You paste it on sugar or cocaine, and sugar and cocaine each mesolimbically activate on their own that whole dopamine and nucleus accumbens system. If you pair this amygdala laser activation to this, you get this synergistic intensification of desire for that thing. So what the dummy rod does not have is the ability to activate these mesolimbic structures. So it's the laser by itself. Now, the surprising thing is, why is it that the shock rod can also become? Well, the shock rod is a threat and it's fearful, but there is some overlap between mesolimbic activation induced by the threat and mesolimbic activation induced by rewards. They're not the same, so there's people who say some dopamine neurons are only activated. There's other dopamine neurons that get activated to both. And even in the nucleus accumbens, we can create sort of fearful motivation that depends on dopamine in the nucleus accumbens in rats. So there's an overlap, and I think it's that overlap, it's sort of an accidental overlap. But once it exists in the brain, it provides the opportunity for even this threat to become irresistibly attractive, irrationally attractive.
do you think that this max, is it just like a fluke? Or do you think there was anything adaptive about?
Yes, I think it's very adaptive. It evolves because it's adaptive, and it may have evolved originally even before there were cognitive desires. That would be very plausible. An example of it being adaptive was the salt, the Dead Sea salt example. That's marvelously adaptive, right? Homes you in like a homing pigeon to that salt in the moment that you need it, even though you have no knowledge based in experience that it's a desirable thing. So it has the capacity for this.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
It's also interesting to me what you're saying about, in a sense, they are conditioning towards fully threatening. There is no, and part of that, and I'm trying to think of like the sort of literature and translating it into like relevant stages stuff. But an example in reinforcement learning work that I'm looking at is that like any cue is rewarding, like even if negative outcome. And it's like, I guess it's like kind of interesting because then it's much better than like a dummy which just has no feedback like at all. So yeah, it's interesting that it's like part of it is like any possible outcome is better than none.
Yeah, so at least some aversive cues for aversive things can become attractive that way. I wouldn't want to say all can. I mean, if there's limits, but there's enough overlap that we can produce this very robust.
Well, that's a very quick anecdote is that I think I'm like a rat or something because like I have this autonomic problem, but I'm so sensitive to salt levels and I'm constantly craving salt. It's useful for me. But then on days when I find that I'm like, oh, I'm actually doing better autonomically, I all of a sudden want sweets, and that almost never happens. So it's just odd to me. And I'm like, I resonate with you.
It's interesting because there have been studies on humans in sodium deficiency, and yes, if you've been in it several times, then you may know what you want and create craving. But when people are induced in sodium deficiency for the first time, they don't wake up suddenly craving salt. They're like Tony Dickinson.
Only once.
Yeah, they feel unwell, but if they have the salt, they do eat more salt if it's in front of them and the cues for salt. If there's a discrete cue to act as a cue, you need that discrete. For the rats, need that discrete cue absolutely. For us, imagery, vivid imagery, can do the same thing.
What does it feel? Can I just interject? What does it feel like when you want salt? How is that different from any other want? Subjectively.
Create like savory cuisine.
And you don't even know things you don't even know are salty. Subconsciously, something reacts to. Here's a quiche, right, which doesn't actually taste that salty, but it's like that.
She stayed away from I ate pork.
But the feeling of wanting to eat doesn't contain within it any idea of salt. You just discover the few foods you grab are the salty.
Yeah, definitely. And yesterday, like I saw the quiches, and I'm like, oh yeah, that'll probably be savory. I think I'll probably like that, but I wasn't craving it just yet. And then I tried the first one, and I'm like, I'm eating 4 pieces.
Can you repeat the point you just made about vivid imagery and the effect it has on humans, but not on rats?
Yes. So, I mean, for the rats, this kind of mesolimbic wanting really depends on the cue, physical cue being present and able to act as a beacon in that way. So Tony Dickinson's rats who are making their choice of what to do, but they don't have a discrete beacon cue, they don't know that they want the salt until they retaste it, like Tony. But in humans, if you could stop a person, so who's woken, say they've woken up in the salt appetite for the first time in their life, they say, I don't feel well, but there's anything in particular I want. Suppose you could ask them, gee, imagine these really salty pretzels or this really salty paste. Now, imagine it. That might create a craving. When you put people in fMRI scanners and ask them to vividly imagine kind of rewards as opposed to thinking about them abstractly, it activates limbic systems in ways as the physical rewards would. So we can make our own cues.
Yeah. So is wanting in your conceptual world a unitary phenomenon? Let me cash that out a little bit. Is wanting sugar the same as wanting stimulation, the same as wanting to avoid embarrassment, the same as wanting a friend, wanting your family? wanting a house on the coast, all this wanting, is it the same phenomenon?
No, I mean, so the reason why we say wanting for, in quotation marks for the Mesolimbic is to distinguish from many other kinds of wanting. So the cognitive desires of Tony Dickinson and others, and the desire to avoid embarrassment, these are not Mesolimbic.
Doesn't even light up.
Well, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would guess not. So desire for world peace, desire for things, there's not going to light up.
Okay, and therefore there isn't any likely to be found, you don't know this, of course, but you guess there isn't likely to be found the equivalent of a mesolimbic organ anywhere else in the brain for all the other wants.
For all the other wants.
Or for a large subset of them.
Right. Well, as I said in the beginning, I think there's multiple want purposes, right? Purposes. So the Mesolimbic one is one, right? All the other ones might be all cognitive.
Yeah.
Following the rational rules, conceivably. So maybe there's just two porpoises. Are there three? I don't know.
But in principle, there could be as many different kinds of want among the cognitive ones. There could be
Yes.
hundreds, there could be thousands.
Yes, that's right. Cognitive makes its own rules and has its own variations. Now, Mesolimbic also, I mean, wanting food is not the same thing as wanting drugs or other, even though they're all Mesolimbic, but they have things in common. They have some neural things in common, certainly, but they also have some psychological things in common, like cues.
Wanting food and what else are you?
Wanting drugs, wanting sex, wanting anything that activates the Mesolimbic system, wanting a sports car, if that's what you want.
Okay, so the two could be in parallel. I could want the drug at two levels. I could want it mesolimbically and I could want it cognitively, and those are independent of each other.
Yes, those are the purposes all going in the same direction. So an addict who says, yes, I know I'm going to like it and I really want it, that's a rational desire.
And those two variables, the cognitive versus the mesolimbic, are all corners of that quadrangle, of that quadrant are filled in as far as you're concerned, right? You can have any degree of either with any degree of the other.
Yes, not all filled in with equal frequency,
Sure.
but all filled in, yes.
What do the psychologists say when they hear you talk this way? What I mean by that is that they want to talk about every want being a little different from every other because it's all experientially embedded. And even you're wanting a car and my wanting a car, even those don't map onto each other well, much less you're wanting a car and you're wanting a bite to eat. Right? So they're all disparate. And here you are coming along and saying, no, there's this dedicated system that captures not all there is to do with wanting, but a big chunk of it.
Well, there's a conversation going on.
Yeah.
I mean, these irrational wants of wanting what you predict to be that, I really mean it as kind of an entry as a conversation to the predictive processing folks. Think of desire being all about predictions of outcomes. This is to say, ooh, there's something else.
Well, you're
What's
just
the counter
right on
reply?
that one. You're just right on that one.
Well, we were waiting for the counter reply from them.
Okay, so you're not even beginning to address their notion of this vast diversity of wants, which you just commandeered a piece of their world taken from them and say, you can't have it because I've got neurophysiological data that shows it's all the same thing.
They might just ignore this, or they might reply.
That's what fields are good at, isn't it?
So fascinating. And, one thing that comes to mind is sort of in behavioral economics, right? And it's sort of entered into, well, it comes from psychology and sort of now associated with behavioral economics. There's this famous distinction between system one and system two. System one just being a shorthand for automatic cognitive processes, and system two being sort of controlled cognitive process, the stuff that, people call conscious, but not in the strict academic philosophical sense. And so here, and one thing that this psychological distinction is often used in reference to is the distinction in behavioral economics between preferences people think they have, expressed preferences, things they say they value, and the revealed preferences. So I used to work with a guy named Mark Kleiman, who's sort of an expert on drug policy, and his view was that we should think of certain drugs as being different from other kinds of goods in the marketplace. They're imitation goods. They're drugs they're things that systematically pull apart people's capacity for rational decision making. And this seems like, this is obvious explanatory power for the distinction between revealed and expressed preferences. So one way of interpreting this in crude terms is that mesolimbic response is a system at system one, a very ancient, kind of mostly automatic system for like quick shortcuts to motivation. And then there's system two, which is more cognitive, more reflective, more amenable to rational interpretation. And most of the time they go together, but that because they're separate systems in the brain, it's possible to disassociate them and put them in conflict with each other. And then you'll get this internally inconsistent preferences. And I guess I'm wondering if you have any reactions to that. And then in terms of like what I was talking about earlier with my talk on meaning, this is obviously quite interesting to me because one of my views is that we can have these deep compulsions that feel like they're important parts of who we are, and we tell rational stories about them, but there's something about them that's deep and forceful in a way that just pure rationality isn't. So I wonder whether it's possible for people to be conditioned, like, I mean, the economist George Lowenstein talked about mountain climbers. They compulsively want to climb Mount Everest. Why? They say, well, because it's there. They just want to do it. It's meaningful to them, and it's almost just like a compulsion they have. Do you think it's possible that in some cases we could talk about preferences we have that are deep enough that we call them meaningful as kind of this combination where some with the stories we tell are rationally coherent and they're rooted in reasons and reflection, but somehow they can become so deeply ingrained, they almost are system one, and they might acquire they might get hooked into the mesolimbic processes.
Yes. No, I totally agree. I mean, this is mesolimbic. This is system one in the Kahneman system one, system two. But system one contains multiple things, and this is one of the things that it contains. And yes, people do construct narratives to be coherent. Sometimes they cannot. So the addicts who the psychiatrists were saying, I can't explain why I'm relapsing. I don't have a reason. I'm searching for a reason, and I just can't find one. Yet I do it. Sometimes crosses boundaries. All I would say is about addiction, about drugs being special for addiction. In a sense they are, but in a sense there's nothing special about them. I mean, drugs, it's like keys in a lock. Drugs are especially good keys to trigger this addictive-like thing. But you saw, cocaine against laser sugar, the laser sugar wins, right? And different people in behavioral addictions like. But the crucial thing is the lock that gets turned by the key. And different individuals have different locks and different dispositions to be easily turned. So kind of interacting. So lots of people take addictive drugs. Bottom line, most people who take addictive drugs don't become compulsively addicted, but some do, and then it can last a lifetime.
I'm going to insert myself in the queue and then come back around. And this might be a very quick and easy to answer question, but I'm wondering if your research might have any traction in area of philosophy of aesthetics. It's talked about this phenomenon that I think is pretty easy to grasp, which is the paradox of war. Why do we enjoy, watching unpleasant things or watching a tragedy unfold or that sort of phenomenon? For some people, they avoid these, but for others, I put myself in this, even though it's a very unpleasant experience to actually watch the tragedy unfold or whatnot in front of me, there is a enjoyment or an attraction to doing that. And I just wonder if the phenomena you've isolated here might have any explanatory capacity in trying to unpack that paradox.
I think conceivably, I mean, there is an overlap. Instead of salience is this want, right? But there is such a thing as fearful salience, which is also mesolimbic dopamine reactant. So the rats who's just, burying the rattlesnake with a shock rod, their mesolimbic system is activated too, and we can stop them from being so afraid by expressing dopamine situations. The thing about, so there's fearful salience, there's incentive salience. It's all one of a family, motivational salience. And motivational salience is never unvalenced, but it can flip its valence. So watching horror movies or being on a roller coaster is sort of a mixture of these things. And it can have both things together, but you can flip into one or all the other. So when we see an accident and we can't not look away, well, that's sort of fearful salience, but maybe there's an element of horror salience too. Some yes, some no, but both can't look away.
This is really cool. I'm wondering, is there anything you can say about in real life that plays the role the laser played in the test? So like why some people might become addicted to binge eating and others become workaholics, or is there an event like a stressful, I don't know, I'm asking.
There's definite individual differences that make us either vulnerable or resistant to dopamine sensitization. Genes are tremendously important. Rats and people, alcohol addictions have a genetic link. So the behavioral geneticists tell us. But what's the laser thing in it, right? And I think, of course, no addict has ever had a laser in the amygdala, but we all have little endogenous activations in the amygdala. And could it be that a person who is vulnerable to mental sensitization, having multiple little excitations in the amygdala, especially with this particular thing, might develop that sensitization, so now has this mesolimbic want. And the laser is a sledgehammer, and it induces this this compulsive motivation on the first day, within 20 minutes. And so we induce it within minutes. Naturally, addictions develop over months, weeks, months, years. And so maybe these endogenous excitations are fulfilling the same role more slowly. That would be my hypothesis. But it has to sort of also play upon these individual differences in vulnerability. We could all have the excitations, but only some of us would become addicted.
Right, so yeah, you and I might react. Is that, I guess I'm wondering about, seems like when people get addicted to binge eating or something, there's usually parents that were strict with food or something, so the M&Ms are extra exciting to them. Is that sort of contextual thing, right?
Yes. So, restricting the food is going to make the M&Ms more exciting, and that's the physiological state gating this incentive salience attributed to the cue. The question is what creates this extra excitation in this individual, not in the other individual. You can imagine two individuals who start gambling, and they both enjoy it, and they both have a little amygdala activations as they're gambling and doing it. But one of them is vulnerable to sensitization as a limbic more than the others, and this one develops compulsions to gamble. The other one is a recreational gambler but can stop. But again, it's a hypothesis. I don't know that this is happening this way, but it's
And Walter, I also know you had your hand up, but also Drew.
I have three-ish, but they're big, I think. So the first one's is all salience motivational? And I think part of my question is, if I think of the human brain and the role of the amygdala and how it's related to especially this other big temporal areas. What if you have that gradient of relevance, so that yes, for the more wanting things, it's very immediate, it's very automatic, so on and so forth. The liking stuff will still be, but it'll be mediated by a lot of abstraction type of regions, relevance, and it just it's hard for motivational failures. Has a lot of information. That's the way I'm I guess rationalizing it.
I'm sure it is involving many other regions too, but I wouldn't say that all salience is motivational. No. Perceptual salience from brightness or color or size, this is equally salient, but it's not for motivational reasons. But motivational salience does make things equally attention grabbing. There's reward eye tracking kinds of things where people are trying to look for particular things. And if you give them reward cues, if they're looking for reward cues, it's great because they can find them more easily. But if they're looking for something else, the reward cues distract them and they can't find what they're looking for as easily. So it's pulling in the attention. There's actually also some reason to think, this is really a Bindra thing, but that hunger can be in the eye of the beholder, literally, with this eye versus that eye. It goes back to experiments in the 1970s, if you can stand 2 minutes of this. Can you be hungry through one eye when you see food, but not hungry when you see the same food through the other eye? You'd say no, right? But here's the experiment. It was Beagley and Holly, Science, 1977. They trained rats to work for food, and which they readily did. And then the rats, they were hungry. And then the rats had a cue that would tell them that they could work for food. They had little eye stalks from a head cap on a light, 2 little light bulbs. So the lights would come on, and now you work for food. When you're hungry, you get food. If the lights are off, you press the levers, no food. So they quickly learned, yes, when the lights are on, you press for food. And they had lateral hypothalamic electrodes put in left and right. And when you turn on the hypothalamic electrodes, the rats eat a lot, so it looks like they're hungry. They are hungry. And if you turn on the electrodes, they'll work for food when the lights are on, so they're hungry. But suppose now you turn on this electrode but not the other, and you turn on this light but not this. Well, they work for food. So turn on this electrode, but now turn on this light. They don't work. Turn on this electrode and this light, they do work for food. Turn on this electrode and this light, they don't work for food. Is the electrode making them hungry? Is the food cue making them go? When they see the light through this eye, it goes to this eye of the brain, and the hypothalamic electrode on that side makes them. So it's a Binder-like toast thing, making the cue attractive. I want to eat. But when it goes to the other side of the brain, that's not, integration's not happening. So it's an incredibly Binder-Totzian phenomenon that otherwise doesn't make sense. Hunger in a sense in the eye of the beholder. That's why when we first said incentive salience, it was with that experiment in mind that I said there's something about the percept that's really crucial.
Just ask like a yes, no question. If like victims of abuse, that's another case.
With abuse?
Yeah, like abuse, negative stigma.
Like being attracted to abusive caretaker. I do think this is a conceivable, this sort of shock rod thing is a conceivable mechanism for that. And even perhaps even for self-harming, some self-harming. The usual explanation for self-harming is that it distracts you from other stresses in life and is a kind of control thing. But is it possible ever that it becomes something that one wants to do, even if it isn't liked, but one wants in a repetitive way? You know, we need to see a little mesolimbic activation. I don't know of any evidence, but I think it's possible.
So I hate to repeat myself, but I want to go back to my morality
Oh,
question, because if this system is, if this structure is tied to system one, then there are going to be certain moral judgments that people make that are counterproductive in terms, they're going to hurt people and gain no benefit. Like, there's certain kinds of punishment where they just do it for retribution. And doing those types of punishments in the past might have served a purpose, but in this case, they don't. It might actually be counterproductive. They learned in the past by getting it, but now they're motivated to do it. And of course, they can make up a story. They can say it's for retribution, it's for justice. They can always say that, but it doesn't look like it's gaining any reward in any sense of liking or relief of pain even.
No, I'm sure you're right. If there are cases where an individual wants to do these evil acts, sort of they want to do it in this incentive-like way, and they might have a little mesolimbic activation as they're doing it, I would say, yes, this could be an explanation for that. And if they're doing the evil acts without that kind of quality, for other reasons, I would say.
But this is not an evil act. This is, a lot of the U.S. criminal justice system wants to punish people when it's recognized that doing so is going to do no good whatsoever. And they base it on these claims about retribution. And I'm not sure whether the fact that they say those things changes, is counter evidence to it really being an instance of the same system.
There are ultimatum games where people will go out, they'll pay money to have the opportunity to just enjoy seeing a cheater get punished in another game.
That's conceivable, yes. Have they been put into fMRI scanners? I would like to see if there's a little mesolimbic activation at that moment. I would say you're onto something.
Yeah, there's scans of that. But the problem with the scans, as you know, the spatial resolution and temporal resolution is not good enough to mimic the kinds of rat studies you do.
Yeah, but there is sort of a mesolimbic signature, that ventral tegmentum, amygdala, nucleus accumbens.
I think you said when I talked to you the other day that mesolimbic systems don't back down on their own even over long periods of time. Is that right? If you remove yourself from the cocaine for 25 years, you could still want it with the same fervor that you wanted it 25 years ago.
The sensitization of the dopamine system, once it's induced, does not back down even if you stop for 20 years.
Doesn't that strike you as weird? Because this must be a very commonly invoked in the course of a lifetime system, commonly overloaded, commonly activated, and gets into that positive feedback loop.
Yeah. Well,
It's just a defect.
it's a feature, it could be a defect. But, the actual mechanisms that make this happen, make it permanent, are things like long-term potentiation in synapses, that are the same mechanisms that are thought to be learning memory mechanisms that are also kind of, so that might be why it's permanent. Defect or is it feature?
Well, you'd think if this was a regulated system, as most of our adaptive systems are, there would be downregulation mechanisms as well as upregulation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for things like tolerance and withdrawal, there definitely, there's downregulation of dopamine receptors as long as you're taking the drugs, so you get tolerance. And if you stop taking the drugs, you have a little natural dopamine, but no receptors, so you have withdrawal. But gradually, most of them come back after you stop. But so those are, molecular cellular changes that do bounce back. But there's other molecular cellular changes that the sensitization pathway is doing in parallel that don't bounce back.
Yeah. I can imagine you overfeed your fish and they die, right? What's going on? Competitive tendency to go after any food in the real world, in the evolutionary history of these fish. There's never been too much food. There's no penalty to overeating. You wouldn't expect a regulatory mechanism to be able to back down hunger when they get too fat. But for something like this, which is such an integral part of everybody's, the feedbacks that are involved here with pleasure and reward and so forth, such an integral part of everybody's life. Isn't it just weird that brains aren't designed to overcome the long-term effects, even the long-term effects? We live a long time.
Well, that's fair. And in a sense, we're all a little like fish, to the extent that we would wish to reduce weight, but there's all these food temptations in our world,
Yeah.
Physiological satiety does dampen incentive salience. It's lower than if we were hungry, but it doesn't abolish it. Incentive salience.
But isn't it true if you took somebody who's living in this society overeating because the food is everywhere, and then you put them in a starvation situation, won't their system more or less reset to the point where they're no longer gluttonous?
In a starvation situation?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, I'm thinking of two things. In World War II, there was the Minnesota hunger study, which was conscientious objectors in World War II who didn't want to fight. They could go to prison, or they could participate in something like this, which was they go to the University of Minnesota and they would be starved. The reason was the authorities knew that people were in starvation camps around the world, and the question was, how are you going to help these people afterwards? So you get some people starved and bring them back. And these were really motivated people because their friends were fighting and dying, and they would go to prison otherwise. So here was a way to serve their country just by being hungry. And if you look at their pictures, they look like concentration camp. They were that thin. They were allowed to go into Minneapolis, but they couldn't go in by themselves because they would defect. They would buy a donut or something. They'd find it too tempting. So they would go in with buddy systems, and that was better, but still some of them would defect. They would dream about food. They would only get a little food at meals, but they would take back a little crumb to the bunks and kind of savor it and like miserly things. And a number of them developed eating disorders that lasted their lifetime after that. That's one case. The other case I'm thinking of is there's such a thing as people who are born without any leptin. It's in Pakistan and Iran, there's a monogenic trait, and so they have no satiety and leptin hormone. And they quickly, as toddlers, become obese, and they're always eating, and they're never satisfied. And if you pop them into a University of Cambridge scanner and show them food cues, their limbic systems always light up intensively, even if they've had a big meal. Yeah. That never goes away. They're permanently feeling starved, even though they're physiologically. But if you give them exogenous leptin, an injection of leptin, and now give them a big meal and put them into the scanner, now there's subdued activation by the food cues. There's a drug fix for this. But in the absence of the drug fix, their permanent starvation never goes away. I mean, they're always hungry, even after the meal. I think of them as the prototype for food addiction. Does food addiction exist? Well, for them it does. For anybody else, it's more open question.
Well, unless we have other questions. We are at time, so yeah.
Thank you.